Hello and welcome to the Exponential Europe podcast. This is the first episode. We are a community with a cause. Exponential Europe wants to see multiplication and reproduction be the norm in the language and behavior of the church in Europe.
That's our vision.
And my name is Jason Lim. I am the leader for Exponential Germany, and I'll be taking you through these episodes as we meet different people and different faces of Exponential Europe. My hope is that you will gain three things from this podcast. One, that you will understand better what Exponential Europe is, who we are, what this community is about. I hope that you will get to meet and appreciate some of the inspiring people that are part of this community in Europe and join me in just celebrating what God is doing Europe-wide. And then thirdly, I hope you will gain insights into what it means to be people of multiplication, to understand multiplication deeper, not just as a strategy, but as a culture. And so to start us off at this episode, I'm here with the great Øivind, Augland, the CEO of Exponential Europe. And I think this is a good point to start with you, because you are the starting point of this all. But maybe before we get to Exponential Europe, we get to you, Øivind.
Thank you.
Give us a little bit about your story, your biography, what God has done in your life.
Yeah, so I'm from Norway. That's a small nation up north. And I'm born in Kristiansand, that's the southernmost city of Norway. And I grew up in a normal home, kind of, Norway is a Lutheran nation, still 70% of the population belongs to the Lutheran State Church. And my mother went in the State Church and my father had a confessing Christian faith. But then a church was planted 200 meters from my home. And I was drawn into the first kind of scouting, and then the youth work in the church. And I radically met Jesus in that church plant when I was 16 years old.
Were you already part of your parents' church?
No.
Or you were just...
I was, in some way, there was a strong, I would say, Christian community in general, because when I was young, I was like in a boys' club in some houses around in the neighborhood of Christians. So there was a Christian environment in some way, but I really met Jesus in that church plant.
Wow.
And then I grew up there and I was recognized as a leader there from the pastor, and I became a pastor there and sent out 23 years old, newly married, from that church to plant another church.
So how old were you when you were drawn into this youth community?
More or less 14, 15, 16 years old. But I really had an experience with the Holy Spirit when I was 16. And after that, there was, in some way, no way back. I was running around in my neighborhood, knocking on door, preaching the gospel to all my neighborhood for 2 years.
What drew you into that community? Were your friends already part of that?
Yeah, it was a little bit because it was close. It was in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
So it was like naturally, you walk 200 meters and then there's the church, there's a good youth work. So I think the neighborhood aspect was so important because we didn't travel to. It was like where we were, in the neighborhood, in the suburb.
Part of your everyday sphere of life already.
Yeah, and I think in that suburb, it was like maybe 3,000 people at that time.
Yeah.
But it was like a newly establishing suburb. So they went into the newly establishing suburb.
Wow.
And they started to plant the church. They had already, years ago, started kind of Sunday school in the suburb.
To prepare kind of.
Yeah.
Wow. And was it quite small? Like how many people were in this?
Well, because they had done a lot of preparing work they had some like Sunday service on a school, but then they even build a building and they kick it off. And then it was like 100 people.
Wow.
So when they kick it off.
And that church plant was also planted out of another church?
Yeah, it was a mother-daughter church from the city center church. So, and that's I grew up in an environment because we planted 6 churches in a short span of time in the city, into the suburb. And honestly, there was one leader, one pastor in the main church, in the old church. The church in the center city was started in 1877. That's old.
That is old.
But there came a pastor there in the beginning of 70, and he said, now the city are growing, and we're going to grow with the city. We're going to go into the suburbs of the city.
Wow.
And they did. So strategically, so I'm more or less on the shoulder of the third and fourth generation of a leader who said, we're going to do this.
And when he was speaking about growing, he wasn't saying, now we will grow our mother church.
No, he
but
said,
we will multiply accordingly into these suburbs so that more stories like you experienced when you were a youth, that people within their neighborhood, close to where they are in the context of their neighborhood, are drawn into these communities.
Yeah, no, we have 8 churches from that in the area. And, looking back and seeing it's like a church planted a church, planted a church, planted a church now, because I went out and planted another church. So that was 4th generation. And looking at these churches, it's like, man, there are so many leaders here. There's so many, and it's close to people, it's in the neighborhood, and it's in a city of 120,000 people.
So when you were there and they saw you, you said they saw a leader in you or something.
Probably.
What do you think, how old were you? Did they just start giving you responsibility or?
Well, I was 16 years old, and then there was some music, so I will put a bass on my shoulder. So I start to play bass and guitar, and you serve into what's need. When you are young, there's need, and you tap into the need, and you try everything.
Yeah.
And then after a while, you find out that you are really not good at something, but you try everything.
Okay. Well,
and I think that's a good leadership advice. When you are like 16 to 22, 25.
Just try things out.
Just try things out.
Yeah.
Don't be too picky. Just try. Yeah. And through that, you learn a lot of leadership and a lot of bringing other people with you.
But it also requires other leaders that give you that space to try things out. And be to kind of risk a bad bass player to just say, just pick up the bass, do something. Yeah. Can you explain a little bit? You say you have a very deep encounter with the Holy Spirit. Was that a one moment, one situation?
Yeah, it was. Honestly, there was a youth meeting, and there was some crazy guys who had experienced something with the Holy Spirit, and there was a move in Kristiansand at that time that God did something on the schools with the student movement. So in that, I was in a meeting, and the Holy Spirit, I'm in Lutheran church. I started speaking in tongues. I didn't know what it really was, but God just did something, and I totally fell in love with Jesus.
And you just gave your whole life, and you said, "Okay."
Yeah, I think that was the defining moment for me.
Right.
That has lasted for some years, 50, 60, 40 years.
Amazing, amazing. Was church planting always something on your mind, or was that just something they recommended, or?
No, but the pastor in the church, that was the pastor when I grew up there. He had a clear understanding and that church planting was important. And I think that's, and then I was in a denomination that planted churches. So, and locally they were planted. So the culture of thinking that was not familiar. It was like natural.
It was already there.
It's already there.
Yeah.
So I'm a lucky guy that had some entrepreneurial gifting, grew up with healthy leadership in a culture where that was a part of the way of thinking.
It was normal.
It's more normal, yes.
We were a plant out of a plant. Obviously, we will continue to plant.
Yeah. So that's that's some of my history that I think has maybe impacted me much more than maybe I thought in that moment.
Right.
Absolutely.
So you planted the 4th generation.
So I planted the third
generation.
And then went out and planted the 4th. So I planted another church.
Was there a moment as you were growing older that you suddenly realized, oh, this is not normal. Not everywhere in Europe are people thinking like this. Do you remember kind of experiencing?
I started to go, because when I saw I had a calling, I went to study at something called Ansgar Theological Seminar. It's in Kristiansand. That's the Evangelical Free Church Seminar in Norway. And I started to study there. And even the teachers there saw that there was something. So already in 1991, then I was 22, they sent me to Germany on what you call the Second European Dawn Conference, like a church planting conference. And that was also kind of a wake-up call for me. I was together with 1,000 people, all church planter, that talked about the same thing, that had the same story. And I met kind of, in that time, the heroes, Johan Lucas, Bob and Mary Hopkins. That's some old guys that most of the young people don't know about that. But then this guy was pioneering church planting in Europe. and in Anglican Church, in the Free Church area. And that was kind of really a wake-up call. And that also ignited, together with other in Norway, that we initiate already in 1993, the first kind of gathering of a national movement in Norway. In 1995, we kick off a national movement. And I've been a part of a national movement of church planting in Norway for 30 years and led it for 10 years.
And then, so your influence and your passion grew beyond Kristiansand, beyond just one city to the nation.
Yeah.
And then it came, you just had a big heart for Europe in general. When did that happen, where you start thinking Europe-wide?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I will say there are phases of life, because, I'm married with Linda, I have 4 kids. So when we planted the first church, we got 4 kids in 6 years. And that was... So I sometimes, you plan church, and you and in the end of that, we felt now it's a time to take a break. So we took a break. We took a family DTS as a family with all the kids. We stopped, and a part of that stopping was also, I was 30 years old. I was still very passionate, and we had launched the church, we had planted the church, and then the elder came to me and said, and it was I'm so happy that I always have honest people around me. So I'm secure that there are honest people that really speak truth, not just kind of... Yeah. And he came to me and said, Øivind, I don't think you should be a pastor. So you have an elder who is 15 years older than you in the church, and he come to you as a founder, the pastor of the church, and say, you shouldn't be a pastor. and I said, because I know he loved me. So I was not threatened by it. So tell me why. Yeah. And then he said the simple thing, you never give us peace. And what he said, that we need more pastoral care, and you are not doing that. And that was a wake-up moment for me, because I was 30 years, and I see that in many church plants, you grow with the pioneer, but you kill the church with the pioneer. I don't know if you have said, but I have seen a lot of that. And that was a wake-up call to understand, I'm more a leader and a pioneer gift than a pastoring, shepherding gift. So we took the sabbatical, we asked God, and we felt it's a time to be released.
Wow. After how many years in that church?
Well, it was like, I was 30, so we started when I was 23, 24, so it's 6 years. We launched it grew, it's established, and and then I said, so what to do? That's a good question. What to do now?
What did your wife say about this? Was she saying...
She agreed.
Yeah.
Which is not helpful. Yeah, she was like, oh, I know.
Yeah.
She could absolutely agree with her.
She was not surprised by the comment.
She was not surprised. and she agreed. So the reality, I then went to the main church in the city. Was a healthy, strong pastor there. And I asked, could I go from Hornets Free Church to plant a church in another suburb? And we took 2 of our people, 2 couple with us. And if they allow to bless that and even pay me to do that. So what we did then is said, because he recognized the giftings of kind of starting up. So what I did, I went in there 50% and I start up another church. Wow. And then I started Bible school, because we felt we need more teaching, more biblical kind of. So we started Bible school 1 day a week, every Friday, 9 in the morning to 3. And honestly, in our small city, we have trained now the last 20 years in that 900 people through that Bible school. So I also started that after 3-4 years, gave it over, and then started a new church and gave it over.
So it doesn't seem like you didn't have enough to do. You are someone that you don't look for things to do. You do things. You just start things. You initiate things.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of saying it.
So how did Exponential, which already existed in the US, come into this, that you felt you even had space for this? Because you were already doing so much already.
I think that it's the lesson learned from Norway also. We started the national movement of church planting. So for 30 years, we have brought together 14, 15 denomination organization with a collaborative vision for planting churches and seeing reproduction and multiplication into the church planting world.
So essentially you wanted to see the story of Kristiansand, which you grew up in,
and Norway,
to
more or
become the
less.
story of Norway, and then to become the story beyond that.
Yeah, I don't think I would say it that way, because I just walked step by step trying to obey God.
Yes.
And often I say, as a leader, like a leader to your blessing is, I try to obey God and make the most out of it, what is set before me.
Yeah.
And when you do that, suddenly God starts to do something more. And because of the network I've already had in Europe, because of the Dawn, I had a network already in the late 90s, beginning of 2000 in Europe. And because out of the national movement in Norway, something called M4 was birthed. And so there was a network there. So when I met with Øivind Hjerme, who's a visionary leader the leader of the Pentecostal movement in Norway now, and a planter of Saltbergen, we really thought that we need something in Europe that focus on church planting, but not only church planting as we see it, church planting with a new view of how can you see reproduction, multiplication, and in that the gospel, disciple, leader, and new churches, like the experience I have seen in Norway, and to how could that happen in many more nations. And that was...
So was it you approaching Exponential or US, or was it...
So in the beginning, approaching that together with a German guy, Jürgen Eisen, and we kind of in some way launched it together. And then after a while, he felt God led him to something, other things. And then I took more or less the leadership. But then also Øystein, who's more a visionary leader and convener, and I will say a content builder. He joined in from the start also because he's a very good friend of Dave Ferguson. So again, it's relational.
Yeah.
It's a community with a cause. So it's a community of people who dream about some of the same.
So flesh out that dream. What do you want to see with Exponential Europe?
Yeah, looking at Europe, we have been on the going down for 60, 70 years. And honestly, it's still in many nations. The traditional church are decreasing. And at the same time, I believe God is doing something new, and especially with the young generation. I was 23 years when moving in, planting the first church. I think we're going to see thousands of beginning of 20 years people creating new community that is not maybe only a copy of what is today, but seeking a way to really reach new people for Christ, disciple them into Christ, and build community that has an impact on their own society where they are. And that's kind of a dream. And we can't reach Europe continuously just adding a church or another church, or maybe another church. We need to find a way to see reproduction and multiplication kind of become the norm. If I look at my life, I see 5, 6 generations of leaders developed behind me and through me, and and that way of thinking that I'm a leader that primarily mostly invest in other leaders and really multiply leaders around me, and also create system of multiplying disciples. That's my role. And I think that's my dream, is to see, I will often explain like this: what if 10% of all churches start on all level to reproduce and multiply? I think it's better to start new than maybe change a lot of the old, but I think it's also a huge possibility in a lot of the old structure to see change within the structure. I'm a Lutheran. I'm coming from a traditional denomination, but I really believe that's also possible. But you see, if I should express, I would like to see if every denomination start to see 10% of the churches start to reproduce gospel disciple leaders and new churches, plant new churches, and that become a movement, then I will say, wow, something new will happen in Europe. And I know it's by the Spirit of God. I know that, but I think we need to create kind of, I will say, a visionary picture and a visionary space where people can run. And I hope Exponential in different nations can create that visionary space of people to run, to see new churches planted in another way that really see disciples and leaders and new churches reproduce and multiply.
Yeah, because if we want to see a shift
Yeah.
in Europe, then multiplication is really a word of encouragement and hope, because
Absolutely.
from very little, and we might feel like there's so few of us. I know many Christians and many church planters feel like, I'm the only Christian in this neighborhood. I'm the only, Christian in this school or university. But multiplication is the hope that says, from very little, much, a big thing can grow, which is the story of Christianity, really.
Absolutely. I'm very inspired by Alpha, to see what have happened with Alpha in Europe and globally, and how simple people or normal people, Christian, can take in Alpha course, run away with the non-Christian people come to faith, start to disciple, and we need to find this, like Alpha has been, a fast, easy tool to really reproduce and multiply.
And so Exponential Europe hopes to raise up or inspire or see that shift in how we approach church planting in Europe, to think more in terms of reproduction and multiplication. Have you seen, now Exponential Europe is like, what do you say, 4 years old? How have you seen some of these shifts or changes? What are you seeing from your point of view in the situation in Europe currently?
Not in a big picture, but in small pockets. I'm happy to have been close to Majak Church in Czech Republic that started 10 years ago with a small group of people, and there are a network of, I think, 12 communities around now, with touching like 2,000 people in Czech, Czech and Slovak, who's the most, I would say, most atheistic nation in Europe. So there are pockets of things happening in Europe. The trouble with Europe is that we are so tribalized in our language group. So, German people don't know what's happening in Czech, or Czech people don't know what's happening in France. So if we can create a community with a cause that inspires us with, I will say, best practices of what's happening in Europe, and we can get that to the surface, I think we can be quite inspired. But I think it's possible.
I remember going to the last Exponential Europe conference in Berlin, and that was one of the moving things for me, was you're in a room with many Europeans from all over Europe, but you feel so unified.
Yes.
Because, like you said, with the Dawn conference in Germany, like everyone's talking about the same thing. You're passionate about the same thing. The young church planters I had with me, they just felt immediately part of this community, really, across Europe, which I think is very, very unique to see that. But we want Exponential Europe to be more than just that conference.
Yeah, absolutely. There needs to be a movement. And that's why, you can't reach Europe in English language. And my English is like, I try to do my best. I call it Norwegian English. But so you need to do it in the language of the nation. That's why we also, with Exponential, now I think we have 12 language web pages where we resource into different languages, and that's the goal, to really, in Romanian, in Ukrainian, in German, in French, Spanish, Slovak, Hungarian, Norwegian, Finnish, Estonian, in all these languages, really work to see how can we resource and create that community of leaders in the different nations, in their own language and culture. Because I think working around and running around in all the nations of Europe for a long time, the culture, the language, it's so diverse from nation to nation. And you need to you can't come with an English language and think you can change Europe. That's impossible. I have to say that.
Yeah, and I think also not just the language piece, but also, like you said, the cultural piece.
Culture, even in the nation.
Yeah.
It's so different.
Yeah. And I think this is some of the pushback sometimes I hear is that, exponential, but that's an American thing. But we're talking about Exponential Europe.
Yeah, and the leadership of Exponential in US, like Dave Ferguson, he has given like a chart blank to do it European. Yeah. Don't copy it. Do it European.
Yeah.
And that's what we try to do. And so we have these kind of groups of people from France and Germany and Norway and England and different nations where we try to see what would it look like. So I think there's a lot to learn from US. I've been on the Exponential conference now in US for many years, and I'm so inspired. You gather 5,000 people, and you have an altar call, and it's like 1,000 coming forward, want to plant churches. That is like, is this true? You know, and there is kind of a spirited dynamic. At the same time, it's like, so I sometimes say it's like the if you call the apostolic and the prophet, like there's a spirited dynamic, at the same time, very action-oriented dynamic. And I love that dynamic. And the leadership of Dave Ferguson has been amazing, honestly, to see that growth. And it's the leading, I think it's absolutely the leading church planting kind of advocate in the US, Exponential now. And I think we can learn from that.
And I think it takes that European humility to realize we need the help and the principles, but it also takes, I think, what Dave Ferguson's humility to say, take these principles, but think about how this fits into, like you said, the diverse cultural context of Europe, because, you know, Spain and Sweden and like Romania and UK is very, very different.
So the topic is this regional that is now in this autumn coming out is Gospel X. From the from the US side, the topic was lost cause. But honestly, you know, in many nations, evangelism and getting out the gospel is not a lost cause. We are desperate on that. We will not survive. So we said to them, forget it. We can't use the language you use. We need to use our language. And then there was an Anglican who come up with, what about gospel X? We need to multiply the gospel. And pull, what is the gospel and how do we really share the gospel and how can we see a reproduction and multiplication of the gospel? And what is a gospel movement in Europe? And we have many historical evidence of a gospel movements in Europe.
Amen.
Let's not go necessarily to all the other worlds to see. Let's deep into our own roots and see what God has done in our continent.
Right.
Because that's amazing.
And I remember this whole wording of multiplying the gospel, also going back in this recent Exponential Europe history to, you know, Raphael Ansberger from France, missiologist, evangelist, who expounded that from Acts. So it's also, you know, some of the language is also in and through Europe, and it's Europeanized, and we're trying to figure out what does this really mean in Europe and in our context.
And in our educated Europe, we need to find a really sound biblical base. You know, we are not primarily pragmatic. We want it to be biblical based. At the same time, a good way of communicating it. We need to communicate things, but we need to have a sound biblical base for everything we do, if everything should be really sustainable in Europe.
And was this part of the reason in the decision to say we're only going to do a Europe-wide conference every 2 years?
Yes.
And then the other years in between, we will focus more on regional, because we need to allow things to go from a European level even down to a more national and regional level.
Or I will maybe say the opposite. Go from a national, regional level up to a European level. Because I don't think you can go from top down in Europe. You need to come from bottom up. And you need to learn from the nation. You need to listen into the nation. Because honestly today, God is doing amazing things. You know, in Europe, you know, in our church, we see people coming to faith. We see a hunger of young people. You know, just last week we have 200 young people, many people just also non-Christians, desperate. You see, so there is something happening.
Right, and so Exponential Europe doesn't just want to be a community of organizations across Europe, though there are Exponential Europe partners that have invested into this and are giving their know-how and their experiences and what they're seeing from Europe. But really, we want this a community to not just be of denominational leaders, but of the practitioners.
And I love to have the practitioner at kind of our European gathering, because a younger practitioner, 35 minus, because I think that will change. You know, I often say when God pours His Spirit out, He pours the Spirit of sons and daughters, and they will speak prophetic. So by definition, the young generation, 35 below, will always be the prophetic generation into every nation. And for me, it's always to look to the next generation and say, how can we release that generation to reach their own generation? If not, we will be dead by 3 generations. And that's what's happening in Europe. But now there is a potential for a new generation to take the faith and also plant churches into their own generation. that have the DNA of something new. And the new, what I pray for is that we see a rapid more reproduction multiplication into everything we do.
Yeah, because we want to create those spaces of, like you experienced,
Yeah.
giving someone the base and just allowing them the space. So I think if people are listening to this and for them to realize if there's anything exponential happening, you are not too young or too inexperienced to come to this. You don't have to be already a successful church planter that has planted 3 churches and multiplied.
Well, there are so few of them. Then we would be just a,
just a
small group of people.
small meeting. But or if you are a church planter, that has experience, you're welcome. But think about the people around you that perhaps are toying with the idea, playing with the idea, or perhaps they're not even thinking about it, but you see potential in them. Bring them with you. These are the people we want at these gatherings because we want to create space for them. Also hear from them.
Absolutely.
From their experiences, their little experience of how they are reaching out to their friends is not any less of a learning experience for us than someone who's planted 3 churches. So I think that's important for people to remember with Exponential Year. We want to see that generation and that space given to them. Where do you see Exponential Europe now? Where are we? What is the...
Well, we are still in a totally pioneer phase of something. Absolutely. And, we had the first kind of European gathering with 400 people last year. And now we have regionals. So we will be in Glasgow, like Scotland, England. We have a smaller gathering in Holland, Germany, Ukraine, Slovak, Hungary, Romania, Moldova, Spain, France. So we will be in all the nations. And then it's really there what we think things happening. So we will both do the regional, but I also prepare with a booklet in all the languages for what we call round tables that will be guided, they can do it in different cities in the nation. So, and then we also launch, so we have 3, we will say, resource tool is the cultural multiplication, the kingdom leader, and then Gospel X. That will be in, I think, 10, 12 languages that can be used. And we'll launch indigenous language website in all the languages and serve the leaders in the language, in the different nations. And so that's where we are now. So we are moving towards next year when we have the topic really on empowered on the spirit. And we gather the 14th to 16th of October in Berlin again in a bigger hall, aiming for 800, 900 people.
Oh, that would be amazing.
In Berlin, that's the 14th to 16th of October. And I think that's where we also I will say, take the next phase of moving into the future. Because it takes time, relationally, it takes a lot of time and to connect and it's really a community. It's not an organization, it's a community where we want to focus on one thing and really also focus into a next generation.
I want to challenge us that, to see these things shift and move forward, like you said, and with the coming topic of the Exponential Europe conference next year of Empowered, that, prayer needs to be a key strategy.
Absolutely.
In all this. So as you listen to this episode, each one of us can just, after the episode, take 5 minutes and just pray for this to happen. So help feed into this prayer. What do you see the challenges of Exponential Europe that the people listening can just take 5 minutes and just pray for?
Yeah, I think, I will say pray and listen to God and ask Him how He can use you. Because everything starts with an individual. Listen to God and obey. We have started with 25 days of prayer. We cover 25 days now in the church starting in August of prayer, just to be a church of prayer. Listen to God. Because in the end, God takes people, individual, and uses it for His cause. And I see again and again, God's calling. I see Norway, it's on so many young people. There's a calling of God on them. And for us, it's just I will say the biggest thing now is to have praying for 1 million of fathers and mothers ready to shepherd that generation who's coming, because that's needed. We need 40, 50, 60 plus who understands the role of being a fathering and mothering, shepherding a young generation into their calling. And that's my big prayer, because that's needed. you can talk about revival, but in the end, someone need to be parents who raise the next generation.
And release them.
And release them into their calling. So that's my deep, really, that God is turning the hearts of the Father to the sons and daughters, because then God is doing something in our nation.
Amen. So I just want to encourage you, take some time after this.
Yes.
Pray so that through His Spirit, the Lord may shift the culture of parents and sons and daughters for reproduction and multiplication to be the norm of the church in Europe again.
That's what we pray for. Thank you.